The gunshot that killed Jack Murphy's wife on their wedding night in 1873 also killed something inside him, though his heart kept beating for 7 more years without her. He had been 22 years old when Sarah died, caught in the crossfire of a saloon brawl they had nothing to do with, her white dress turning crimson as she fell into his arms on what should have been the happiest night of their lives. The Texas Rangers caught the man who fired the shot 3 days later, but justice did not bring Sarah back, and Jack found he could not stay in San Antonio where every street corner reminded him of her laugh, her smile, the way she had looked at him like he hung the moon and stars just for her. So he rode. He took work where he could find it, driving cattle from Texas to Kansas, breaking horses for ranchers who needed skilled hands, even spending a season as a deputy in a small Colorado town before the memories caught up with him again and he moved on. By 1880, at 29 years old, Jack Murphy had seen more of the West than most men saw in a lifetime, and he had danced alone at more town socials than he could count. It started in Abilene, 6 months after Sarah died. The ranch foreman who had hired him insisted all the hands attend the town social, said it was good for relations between the ranch and the townfolk. Jack had tried to refuse, but the foreman would not hear it, so he went, standing against the wall with his hat in his hands while fiddle music filled the air and couples spun across the makeshift dance floor in the town square. Then an older woman, somebody's grandmother with kind eyes and gray hair, had approached him and asked why such a handsome young man was not dancing. Jack had tried to explain, stumbling over words, but she had simply patted his arm and said that his wife, wherever she was, would not want him to stop living. So Jack had stepped onto that dance floor alone, moving through the steps Sarah had taught him in the weeks before their wedding, and for 3 minutes he felt close to her again. After that, he danced alone at every social in every town he passed through. It became his ritual, his way of keeping Sarah's memory alive. The townsfolk whispered about him, the handsome cowboy with the sad eyes who waltzed by himself while everyone else paired off. Some women tried to approach him to offer themselves as partners, but Jack always politely declined with a tip of his hat and a soft "Thank you, ma'am, but I dance with a memory." In the spring of 1880, Jack found himself in Silver Creek, New Mexico Territory, a mining town that had sprung up in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He had been hired by a rancher named Thomas Whitmore who ran cattle on the grasslands east of town. Good work with decent pay, and Jack figured he might stay through the summer before the restlessness took him again. The social was held on a Saturday night in late May, in the town square where paper lanterns had been strung between the buildings, and a small band played on a raised platform. Jack arrived as the sun was setting, painting the mountains purple and gold, and took his usual position against the wall of the general store, watching as families arrived and young people eyed each other with the nervous excitement of potential romance. He recognized most of the ranch hands from Whitmore's spread, along with miners from the silver operations in the hills, merchants from town, and farmers from the valley. The music started, a lively reel, and the dance floor filled with couples. Jack waded through 3 songs, sipping the lemonade someone had pressed into his hand, before he set down his cup, removed his hat, and stepped onto the floor alone. He was halfway through a waltz, eyes closed, remembering the way Sarah had fit perfectly in his arms, when he felt something change in the air around him. He opened his eyes to find a woman standing directly in front of him, her hand extended, her face serious and determined. She did not say a word. She simply stood there, her brown eyes locked on his, her hand steady in the space between them. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun with a few wisps escaping to frame her face. She was not classically beautiful in the way Sarah had been, but there was something arresting about her, a strength in the set of her shoulders and the directness of her gaze that made Jack forget to breathe for a moment. He stared at her extended hand like it was a rattlesnake, his heart pounding. For 7 years he had refused every offer to dance, had kept his grief close like a shield against the world. But something about this woman's silence, the fact that she did not plead or cajole or try to convince him with words, made him hesitate instead of immediately declining. She waited. The music continued around them. Other dancers swept past. And still she stood with her hand out, not speaking, just looking at him with those steady brown eyes that seemed to see right through to the broken parts of him. Jack's hand moved almost of its own accord, his fingers touching hers, and then she was stepping into the dance, her other hand coming to rest on his shoulder as his settled at her waist. She moved with confidence, following his lead effortlessly, and for the first time in 7 years, Jack Murphy danced with someone real instead of a memory. They did not speak. She seemed to understand that words would shatter whatever fragile thing was forming between them. They simply moved together through the rest of the waltz, and when the music ended, she squeezed his hand once, offered him a small smile, and walked away into the crowd before he could even ask her name. Jack stood frozen on the dance floor, his hand still warm from her touch, feeling like he had just woken up from a 7-year sleep. "That is Emma Carson," a voice said beside him, and Jack turned to find Tom Whitmore, his employer, standing with a cup of punch and a knowing look on his weathered face. "She runs the boarding house on 3rd Street, lost her husband in a mine collapse 4 years ago, has not danced with anyone since until tonight." Jack looked back at the crowd, trying to spot the blue dress, but she had disappeared. His heart was racing in a way it had not since before Sarah died, and he did not know whether to be terrified or grateful. "She is a good woman," Tom continued, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Strong, the kind who survives what life throws at her and comes out tougher on the other side. She has been watching you the past 2 weeks since you came to town. I figured it was only a matter of time before one of you worked up the nerve to do something about it." "I did not," Jack started, then stopped, not sure what he meant to say. He had not done anything. She had been the one to approach him, but he had been the one to take her hand. "Maybe you should stop by the boarding house," Tom suggested. "Thank her for the dance." Jack wanted to say no, wanted to retreat back into his comfortable grief, but his feet were already carrying him toward 3rd Street before his mind caught up with his body. The boarding house was a 2-story building with a wide porch and flower boxes under the windows, neat and well-kept in a town where most structures still had the raw lumber look of recent construction. Light spilled from the downstairs windows, and Jack could see shadows moving inside. He climbed the steps, his boots loud on the wooden planks, and knocked before he could talk himself out of it. The door opened, and there she was, still in the blue dress, a dish towel in her hands, and a look of surprise on her face that quickly shifted to something softer. "I wanted to thank you," Jack said, the words coming out rougher than he intended, "for the dance." Emma Carson studied him for a long moment, then stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." "I just made coffee." Her parlor was simple but comfortable, with a sofa and 2 chairs arranged near a stone fireplace, and a bookshelf crammed with well-worn volumes along one wall. She gestured for him to sit, while she disappeared into what he assumed was the kitchen, returning a moment later with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of cookies. "I have 6 boarders right now," she said as she handed him a cup, settling into the chair across from him. "All minors. They are at the social or the saloon, so we have the place to ourselves for a bit." Jack wrapped his hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to do with them. "Tom Whitmore said you have not danced since your husband died." "Tom talks too much," Emma said, but there was no heat in it. She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes on his face. "But he is right. Robert died in 1876. We had been married for 3 years. He was a good man, a hard worker. The mine collapse took 17 men. The whole town went into mourning. "I am sorry," Jack said, meaning it. "I know you are," Emma replied. "I know about your wife, Sarah. Was that her name?" Jack's throat tightened, but he nodded. "She died on our wedding night. 7 years ago this past December." They sat in silence for a while, two people who understood loss in a way that could not be explained to those who had not felt it. Finally, Emma said, "I have been watching you dance alone for the past 2 weeks. At first I thought you were just strange, maybe touched in the head. But then I realized what you were doing. You were keeping her alive the only way you knew how. It seemed important," Jack said quietly, "to not forget." "I understand that," Emma said. "After Robert died, I kept his tools in the barn, exactly where he left them. I would go out there sometimes and just stand among them, remembering the way he used to whistle while he worked. But after a while I realized I was not keeping him alive, I was keeping myself dead." Jack looked up sharply, her words hitting him like a physical blow. "I put away the tools," Emma continued. "I sold most of them, gave some to his brother. And I started living again, not because I stopped loving Robert, but because staying frozen in that moment of losing him was not honoring his memory. It was wasting the life I still had." "Is that why you asked me to dance?" Jack asked. "To teach me a lesson?" "No," Emma said firmly. "I asked you to dance because I have been alone for 4 years, and I am tired of it. And because when I saw you out there, dancing by yourself with your eyes closed and that look on your face, I thought maybe you were tired of it too." She was right, Jack realized with a start. He was tired. Tired of moving from town to town, tired of keeping everyone at arm's length, tired of measuring his life against a single perfect memory that grew more idealized with each passing year. Sarah had been wonderful, but she had also been real, with flaws and frustrations and the normal complications of life. And somewhere in the past 7 years, he had turned her into a saint instead of remembering her as the woman she actually was. "I do not know if I can," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like betraying her." "My Robert would have hated knowing I spent 4 years alone," Emma said. "He was always trying to get me to be more social, to make more friends. He would have wanted me to be happy. What would your Sarah have wanted?" Jack thought back to the last conversation he had with Sarah before they walked into that saloon, before the gunshot, before everything changed. They had been talking about their future, about the ranch they wanted to buy, the children they wanted to have. She had made him promise that they would live every moment fully, that they would not waste a single day of their lives together. He had broken that promise 7 years ago, and he had been breaking it every day since. "She would have wanted me to be happy," Jack said finally, the words like stones in his mouth. "She would have hated this." Emma leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her face serious. "I am not asking you to forget her. I am not asking you to stop loving her. I am just asking if maybe you might have room in your life for something new, something different." Jack met her eyes, those steady brown eyes that did not flinch from hard truths. "I do not even know you." "Then get to know me," Emma said simply. "Come by for coffee tomorrow, we can talk. No promises, no expectations, just two people having a conversation." It should have been terrifying, this idea of opening himself up again after so long sealed shut. But sitting in Emma's comfortable parlor, drinking her coffee and looking at her earnest face, Jack found it was not terror he felt but something closer to relief. "All right," he said, "tomorrow." The smile that broke across Emma's face was like sunrise after a long night, and Jack felt something in his chest crack open just a little bit, letting in the first rays of light. He came by the next day as promised, and the day after that, and the day after that. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their pasts, their lost loves, their hopes for futures they had both stopped believing in. Emma told him about growing up in Missouri, about coming west with Robert chasing dreams of silver, about learning to run a boarding house when the mine took him. Jack told her about Texas, about Sarah, about the 7 years of wandering that had brought him to Silver Creek. They did not rush. Both of them had learned the hard way that life could change in an instant, and they wanted to be sure, to build something solid that could weather the storms they knew were coming. Jack continued working at Whitmore's ranch, earning a reputation as the best horse breaker in the territory. Emma continued running her boarding house, though Jack noticed she started joining him for dinner at the ranch when Tom's wife invited them both. The town watched their courtship with interest. Some approved, glad to see two mourners finally moving on. Others whispered that it was too soon, that they were dishonoring their dead spouses. Jack and Emma ignored the gossip, focused only on the fragile, growing thing between them. It was different from what Jack had with Sarah. That had been the passionate, heedless love of youth, full of fire and certainty. This was steadier, built on shared grief and hard-won wisdom, on understanding that life was precious and uncertain and should not be wasted. Jack did not love Emma less than he had loved Sarah, he realized. He loved her differently, with the heart of a man who had been broken and put back together with all the cracks still showing. By July, Jack had moved from the ranch bunkhouse into one of Emma's boarding rooms, though he was careful to maintain propriety, knowing the town was watching. By August, he was taking his meals at her table and helping her with repairs around the boarding house. By September, when the aspen trees in the mountains turned gold and the air took on a crisp edge, Jack realized he wanted to stay in Silver Creek, wanted to build a life here with this woman who had extended her hand when he needed it most. He proposed on a Sunday afternoon in late September, in the kitchen of the boarding house while Emma was rolling out pie dough, and he was supposedly fixing a loose hinge on the cabinet. He had not planned it, had not bought a ring or prepared a speech. The words just came tumbling out, rough and honest. "I want to marry you," he said, and Emma stopped mid-roll, flour dusting her hands and a streak of it across her cheek. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "What?" "I want to marry you," Jack repeated, his heart hammering. "I know it has only been a few months, I know people will talk. But I have wasted 7 years of my life, Emma, and I do not want to waste another day. I love you. Not the same way I loved Sarah, but just as much. Maybe more, because I know now how rare this is, how lucky I am to get a second chance." Emma set down her rolling pin with careful precision, wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the kitchen to stand in front of him. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes." Jack repeated, hardly daring to believe it. "Yes, I will marry you," Emma said. And then she was kissing him, flower and all, and Jack was wrapping his arms around her and thinking that maybe, finally, he could stop running. They were married in October, in the same town square where Emma had first extended her hand to him. The whole town came, including Tom Whitmore and his wife, all of Emma's boarders, the ranch hands Jack had worked with, even the minister who had buried Sarah 7 years ago and happened to be passing through New Mexico on his way to California. Jack wore his best suit, the one he had not worn since his wedding to Sarah, and found that it no longer hurt to put it on. Emma wore a dress of deep green that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and she carried a bouquet of late-season wildflowers that one of the ranch wives had gathered from the meadow. As they said their vows, Jack thought about Sarah, about the girl he had loved and lost, and he sent up a silent prayer thanking her for the time they had had together and asking her blessing for this new beginning. He thought he felt something, a warmth in the air like a touch on his shoulder, and he chose to believe it was her way of saying she understood, that she wanted him to be happy. The reception lasted well into the evening, with dancing and food and celebration. When the fiddle struck up a waltz, Jack turned to Emma and extended his hand with a small smile. She took it without hesitation, and they moved onto the floor together, not alone this time but as partners, as equals, as two people who had found their way through grief to something resembling joy. Later that night in the boarding house that was now their home, Emma said, "Tell me about her, about Sarah." They were in bed, the lamp turned low, and Jack's first instinct was to deflect, to keep that part of himself separate. But he realized that was not fair to Emma, and it was not fair to Sarah's memory either. So he talked, really talked, about his first love in a way he had not been able to do in 7 years. He told Emma about Sarah's terrible singing voice and her love of terrible puns. He told her about their fights because they had fought, about the way Sarah could be stubborn and impractical. He told her about the good and the bad, the real and the complicated, and as he talked he felt the last chains of his grief loosen and fall away. When he finished, Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "She sounds like she was wonderful. I wish I could have met her." "She would have liked you," Jack said, surprised to find he meant it. "She always said I needed someone who would not put up with my brooding." Emma laughed, a warm sound in the darkness. "Tell me if I ever fail in that department." They settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Emma continued running the boarding house, though Jack took over most of the heavy maintenance work. He kept working at Whitmore's ranch too, finding that he enjoyed the rhythm of the work and the company of the other hands. For the first time since Sarah died, Jack felt like he had a home instead of just a place to sleep between jobs. The first real test came in December, on the anniversary of Sarah's death. Jack woke early that morning, the old grief sitting heavy on his chest, and slipped out of bed trying not to wake Emma. He made coffee in the kitchen and sat at the table watching the sun come up, thinking about a girl in a blood-stained white dress and all the years they had lost. Emma found him there an hour later. She did not say anything, just poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. Finally, Jack said, "7 years ago today my life ended. I have been walking around dead ever since." "But you are not dead now," Emma said gently. "You are here with me, living." "I know," Jack said, "and I am grateful for that, but I still miss her. Is that wrong?" "Of course not," Emma said firmly. "She was your wife, you loved her. That does not just disappear because you found love again." "I still miss Robert, especially around the anniversary of the mine collapse. Missing them is not wrong, Jack, it is human." They sat together in the growing light, two people bound by love and loss, and Jack felt the weight on his chest ease a little. Later that day, he rode out to the small cemetery on the edge of town, where the victims of violence and misfortune were laid to rest. There was no grave for Sarah here. She was buried in San Antonio, but Jack found a quiet spot under a cottonwood tree and said the things he needed to say, the goodbye he had never properly given her. When he rode back to town, Emma was waiting on the porch of the boarding house, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the December cold. Jack dismounted, tied up his horse, and climbed the steps to take her in his arms. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" Emma asked. "For understanding," Jack said. "For not asking me to choose." "You do not have to choose," Emma said. "Your heart is big enough for both of us. I have never doubted that." The years that followed were good ones. Silver Creek prospered as the mines continued to produce, and more settlers arrived, bringing their families and their hopes. The boarding house stayed full, providing Emma and Jack with a steady income. Jack became foreman at Whitmore's ranch when the old foreman retired, and he found he had a talent for managing both horses and men. In 1882, Emma discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. Emma was 32 years old, older than many first-time mothers, and they both knew the risks. But the pregnancy progressed smoothly, and on a cool morning in March of 1883, Emma gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady eyes. They named him Robert Jack Murphy, honoring both of the people they had lost and the new life they were building together. Jack held his son in his arms and felt the last broken piece of himself finally heal over. He had not thought he would ever have children, had believed that part of his future died with Sarah, and the gift of it overwhelmed him. "He looks like you," Emma said from the bed, exhausted but smiling. "He has your eyes," Jack replied, unable to look away from the tiny, perfect face. "Then he will see the world clearly," Emma said, and Jack leaned down to kiss her forehead, his heart so full he thought it might burst. Robert was a happy baby who grew into an energetic toddler, constantly underfoot at the boarding house and the ranch both. Jack taught him to ride almost as soon as he could walk, setting him on gentle horses and leading them around the corral while Emma watched with her heart in her throat. The town doted on the boy, the living symbol of two people who had chosen to live again after loss. In 1885, Emma had a second child, a daughter they named Sarah Rose. Jack had suggested the name tentatively, afraid Emma might think it inappropriate, but Emma had squeezed his hand and said, "She would be honored. I am honored." Sarah Rose was quieter than her brother, with dark curls and her father's serious expression. But when she smiled, it was like the sun coming out. Jack found that naming his daughter after his first wife did not hurt the way he had feared. Instead, it felt right, like he was finally able to hold both loves in his heart without conflict. The boarding house grew too small for their growing family, so in 1886, they bought a piece of land on the edge of town and built a proper house. A two-story structure with a wide porch and enough bedrooms for their children and any future additions. Emma kept running the boarding house, hiring a woman from town to help manage it, while Jack continued working at the ranch and helping raise their children. Tom Whitmore retired in 1888, selling the ranch to Jack and two of the other hands who had worked there for years. It was a risk, going into partnership and taking on that kind of debt, but the cattle business was good and they made it work. Jack found he enjoyed the challenge of running his own operation, of building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. On a warm evening in May of 1890, almost exactly 10 years after Emma had extended her hand to him at that first social, Jack stood on the porch of their house watching his children play in the yard. Robert was 7 now, tall for his age and fearless, teaching his 5-year-old sister to rope a fence post. Emma came out to join him, slipping her hand into his, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked quietly, "staying here with me instead of moving on?" Jack turned to look at her, taking in the silver threads in her dark hair, the lines around her eyes from years of smiling, the strength in her shoulders that had only grown with time. "Not for a single moment," he said honestly. "You saved my life, Emma, you and these children. You gave me a reason to stop running." "You saved mine too," Emma said. "I was just existing before you came along. You reminded me what it meant to really live." They kissed, a gentle press of lips that still sent warmth through Jack's chest after 10 years of marriage. The children made gagging noises from the yard, and Emma laughed, pulling away to call out, "Just you wait until you are older. You will understand someday." That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Jack stood at the window of their bedroom looking out at the stars. He thought about Sarah, as he sometimes still did, remembering her with fondness instead of grief. He hoped she had found peace wherever she was. He hoped she knew he had found happiness, that her death had not destroyed him forever, that he had learned to dance with a partner again instead of alone. Emma came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how lucky I am," Jack said, turning in her arms to face her. "About how I could have said no when you offered your hand. About how different my life would be if I had kept refusing, kept dancing alone." "But you did not refuse," Emma pointed out. "You took my hand." "Best decision I ever made," Jack said, and meant it with everything in him. The years continued to roll by, bringing change and challenges but also joy. Silver Creek evolved from a rough mining town into an established community with schools and churches and a proper main street. The silver started to run out in the early 1890s, but by then the town had diversified enough to survive, with ranching and farming taking over as the main industries. Robert grew into a fine young man, learning the ranching business from his father and showing a natural talent for it. Sarah Rose, true to her namesake, developed a stubborn independence that both frustrated and delighted her parents. In 1895, Emma gave birth to their third and final child, another boy they named Thomas after Tom Whitmore, who had died the previous winter at the age of 73. Jack stood by Tom's grave with Emma at his side, their children around them, and said a prayer of thanks for the man who had employed him, befriended him, and pushed him toward Emma when he had been too stubborn to see what was right in front of him. Tom's widow clasped Jack's hand at the funeral and said, "He was so proud of you. He always said you were the son he never had." The word stayed with Jack, a reminder that family was not always blood, that the connections forged through choice and circumstance could be just as strong as those of birth. He thought about all the people who had helped him along the way, from the grandmother in Abilene who had first encouraged him to dance, to Tom who had told him Emma's name, to Emma herself who had been brave enough to reach out when he was drowning in grief. By the turn of the century, Jack was 49 years old, his hair more gray than dark, his body bearing the aches and pains of a life spent working with horses and cattle. But he was happy in a way he had never imagined possible in those dark years after Sarah's death. He had a wife who understood him, children who made him proud, a successful ranch, and a place in a community he had helped build. On a May evening in 1900, 20 years to the day after Emma had first extended her hand to him, they held a party at their house to celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary. The whole town came, as did their children, now 17, 15, and 5 years old. There was food and music and laughter, and as the sun began to set, the fiddle player struck up a waltz. Jack stood and extended his hand to Emma, echoing that moment 2 decades ago when she had done the same for him. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally, and Emma smiled, taking his hand. "You may," she said, and they moved onto the makeshift dance floor in their yard, surrounded by family and friends, under a sky turning gold and pink with the sunset. As they danced, Jack thought about the long, winding road that had brought him to this moment. He thought about Sarah, the girl he had loved and lost, and he sent up a silent thank you for the time they had had together, brief though it was. He thought about the 7 years he had spent dancing alone, keeping her memory alive but refusing to fully live. And he thought about Emma, the woman who had seen through his grief to the man underneath, who had been patient and brave enough to offer her hand without words, trusting that he would understand what she was offering. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked, following his lead as easily as she had that first night. "About how you changed everything," Jack said. "About how one moment of courage from you gave me back my life." "It gave me back mine too," Emma said softly. "We saved each other, Jack. That is what love does." The music swelled and Jack pulled Emma closer, grateful beyond measure for this second chance, this unexpected grace. He had learned that grief and joy could coexist, that you could honor the past while embracing the future, that the human heart was capable of holding more love than he had ever imagined possible. Around them, their children watched with smiles and the town looked on with approval, and the sun sank lower toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold. Jack Murphy, who had once danced alone at every town social for 7 long years, now danced with his wife of 20 years, with his children and his community and his whole life spread out before him like a gift he had finally learned to accept. The party continued long into the night, with dancing and storytelling and celebration. When it was finally over and the last guests had gone home, Jack and Emma stood on their porch in the starlight, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. 20 more years. Emma asked, her voice quiet in the darkness. 20 more and 20 after that, Jack promised, as many as we are given. Then we had better make them count, Emma said, and Jack could hear the smile in her voice. We will, Jack assured her, kissing the top of her head, every single day. They stood there together under the stars, two people who had found each other in grief and built a life in joy, and Jack knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The road had been long and hard, marked by loss and loneliness, but it had led him here, to this woman and this family and this home, and he would not change a single step of it. The years that followed were filled with the ordinary miracles of daily life. Robert took over more responsibility at the ranch as Jack grew older, showing the same dedication and skill his father had. Sarah Rose surprised everyone by deciding to become a teacher, studying hard and eventually opening a school in Silver Creek. Young Thomas, named for the man who had set all of this in motion, grew up with his father's love of horses and his mother's steady temperament. Emma and Jack grew old together, their hair turning white, their bodies slowing down, but their love only deepening with each passing year. They were fixtures in Silver Creek, the couple everyone pointed to as an example of enduring love, though few knew the full story of how they had found each other. On quiet evenings, sitting on their porch and watching the sunset, Emma would sometimes ask Jack to tell her about Sarah, and he would share his memories, keeping his first love alive through stories shared with his second. And sometimes, Jack would ask Emma about Robert, and she would talk about the young miner who had stolen her heart, and they would sit in comfortable silence. Two people who understood that love did not end with death. It simply transformed into something that could be carried forward. In 1915, at 64 years old, Jack Murphy finally retired from active ranching, turning over the full operation to Robert and his growing family. Jack had 5 grandchildren by then, with more on the way, and he took great joy in teaching them to ride and rope and love the land the way he did. Emma had finally sold the boarding house a few years earlier, ready to spend her days focused on her family instead of managing tenants. They traveled some in those retirement years, finally visiting San Antonio so Jack could show Emma where he had grown up and introduce her to Sarah's grave. It was a pilgrimage Jack had put off for decades, afraid of what it would stir up, but when they stood together at the simple headstone in the Texas cemetery, he felt only peace. "Hello, Sarah," Jack said softly, Emma's hand firm in his. "I wanted you to meet Emma. She is the woman who taught me how to live again. I hope you do not mind that I named our daughter after you. I hope you understand that I had to move on, had to find a way to be happy again. But I never forgot you. I never will." The Texas wind blew warm across the cemetery, and Emma squeezed his hand. They stood there for a while, the three of them connected across the boundaries of life and death, and when they finally walked away, Jack felt lighter than he had in years. They returned to Silver Creek, to their children and grandchildren, to the town they had helped build and the life they had created together. Jack knew his time was growing shorter, that the years were catching up with him, but he faced the future without fear. He had lived fully, loved deeply, and left a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. On a spring morning in 1920, at the age of 69, Jack Murphy died peacefully in his sleep, Emma holding his hand. The whole town came to his funeral, along with his children and grandchildren, his ranch partners and people from as far away as Colorado who had worked with him over the years. They laid him to rest in the Silver Creek Cemetery under a cottonwood tree with a simple headstone that read, Jack Murphy, 1851 to 1920, beloved husband, father, and friend. Emma stood by the grave with dry eyes, her children around her, and said a quiet goodbye to the man who had taken her hand on a dance floor 40 years earlier and never let go. She did not cry, not then, because she knew Jack would not want tears. He would want celebration, gratitude for a life well lived and a love that had healed them both. She lived another 8 years, watching her grandchildren grow, helping Sarah Rose with the school, spending time at the ranch with Robert's family. She spoke often of Jack, keeping his memory alive the way he had kept Sarah's alive all those years, but she did not dwell in the past. She lived each day fully, honoring the lessons they had both learned about the preciousness of time and the importance of choosing life over grief. When Emma Carson Murphy died in her sleep in 1928 at 77 years old, her children buried her next to Jack under the cottonwood tree. Her headstone was simple too. Emma Carson Murphy, 1851 to 1928, beloved wife, mother, and friend. The town remembered them for generations after, the cowboy who had danced alone and the woman who had extended her hand without a word, two people who had found in each other the courage to love again after loss. Their story became part of Silver Creek's history, passed down through their children and grandchildren, a testament to the power of second chances and the resilience of the human heart. And on warm spring evenings, when the wind blew just right through the cemetery, some people swore they could hear the faint sound of fiddle music, and if they looked closely at the shadows under the cottonwood tree, they might catch a glimpse of two figures dancing together, finally and forever reunited, moving in perfect harmony through an endless waltz.